Vinland Saga is an anime that draws on real events and characters to tell an original, that is to say, fictional story. This video will be about how Vinland Saga reflects, accurately or inaccurately, the Viking Age. First, I'll provide an overall summary on how the series relates to history, in part based on an interview with its creator, Makoto Yukimura. Then I'll describe the actual historical context of the book, mainly the Viking invasions of England. Vikings have a very large cultural profile even in the modern day, and with that comes a lot of confusion. I will also try and define terms like Norse, Viking, and Germanic and try and situate the period correctly in the context of major ongoing historical trends. Then, I will make comparisons on the basis of cultural aspects of Viking life depicted in the show, such as the importance of slavery and religion, to round out your view of the everyday life of a Viking. I hope that this video will make Vinland Saga a show that you can appreciate in its wider context, and not just another sound in the cacophony of historical fiction that is set during the Viking Age. What I will not cover. First, there will be no major spoilers beyond the general premise of the show. Second, I will not be looking closely at the real-life people that correspond to characters in the show. Most of these connections are a bit tenuous anyways. Instead, I'll be focusing more on the big picture, the sweeping changes in the general groups of people that shape this influential part of history. The anime starts around the year 1012 and begins by depicting Viking raids of England, which really did occur. Even the specific real-life cause of heightened tensions is shown. In 1002, Danes living in England were killed in the St. Brice's Day massacre, which served as the justification for King Swin of Denmark, who was mentioned in an early episode, to launch a larger invasion. From that point on, however, as the anime progresses with the increased involvement of the show's characters, who are mostly not part of that conflict in real life or not even based on real people at all, the plot turns more towards the realm of fiction. I found an interview with Makoto Yukimura, who created the famous science fiction manga Planetes, on the occasion of the release of the Vinland Saga manga, where he discusses his creative process. After his work on Planetes, he had the chance to keep writing. He wanted to do a story on Vikings and read about the real-life Thorfinn for inspiration. However, he found the motivations of the real Thorfinn a bit unsatisfying and decided to apply his imagination to invent a possible background and set of experiences for Thorfinn and create the story we all now enjoy. Also, here's an interesting although unrelated response. Contrary to the immense bravado displayed in Vinland Saga, Yukimura does not feign an equivalent toughness. In the interview, he readily admits to, in my interpretation of his own words, being a timid person who quickly raises the white flag when there is a quarrel. Yukimura's approach advises how to understand Vinland Saga. Strands of historical research and truth are woven with a significant amount of originality, but not so much that you can't uncover the truth, which I will try to do in the rest of this video. Let's get into some real history. First, some essential background. What is a Viking? Vikings were Norsemen, specifically only those engaged in raiding and exploration during the Viking Age from 793 to 1066. It describes an occupation, not an ethnic group. The word Viking at the time simply meant pirate. The term therefore does not refer to all Norsemen. Who were the Norsemen or the Norse people? Norse people were Germanic people who inhabited Scandinavia, that is modern Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, during this same period. Okay, so who were the Germanic people? Germanic is a term from the Roman Empire that does not have much to do with modern Germany. It reflects to a broad, ethno-linguistic group of people who lived in Northern Europe and spoke Germanic languages. This includes Old Norse, a North Germanic language spoken by the Norse people, which evolved into the modern Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, Icelandic, and others. In fact, the Germanic tribes actually originated in Scandinavia, spreading out onto the continent starting in the late Bronze Age around 1000 BC. 2,000 years later, by 1000, the Norse people were one of the many subgroups of Germanic people. Finally, I want to clarify the meaning of the term Anglo-Saxon. Anglo-Saxons are a cultural group who resided in Great Britain from the 5th century. This group formed through interactions between indigenous British and Germanic tribes who migrated there and invaded Britain starting in the years around 450, when it was still part of the Roman Empire. It is mostly because of these interactions that the modern English language is also a Germanic language. This is also the period of time where the mythological figure King Arthur was said by early sources to have ruled, leading the resistance against the Saxons, but the details about that are another video unto itself. The key here is to notice that the Anglo-Saxons were a first wave of Germanic people in Britain that preceded a second wave during the Viking Age. That was a lot of definitions, but I think it's important to clear up some of these terms that are often heard but less frequently explained. I think it also gives an idea of where the parties in the story originated from, and will hopefully allow you to comprehend better what you hear about this topic in the future. Getting back to the show, the important thing to highlight that is mentioned briefly in the show is that there was significant Danish settlement in Britain at the time of the Viking raids. Though many early Vikings would return home to Scandinavia with their loot, over time, Danish settlement led to a large part of Britain, particularly the east coast, coming under Danelaw, where the Danish population dominated and their laws were in effect. To this day, many English cities in the area still have names that were originally created by the Vikings. One such category of cities is those with the suffix by, which meant village in Old Norse, such as Grimsby or Whitby. This is important because Viking raids were not a sudden occurrence. In fact, the show occurs near the end of the Viking Age, by which point raids on Anglo-Saxon villages and churches, as well as settlement in Britain by Scandinavians, had already been going on for hundreds of years. The contacts were extensive enough that historians sometimes use the term Anglo-Scandinavian to refer to these groups of originally Norse settlers. With a better idea of the big picture in which the show takes place, let's take a closer look at some aspects of Viking life. First, let's discuss the basis for all this knowledge. The anime gets its name from the Vinland Sagas, Icelandic texts which recount tales of exploration of Vinland, or North America. These are studied by historians, and very much like the modern Vinland Saga we enjoy, they have some correspondence with real events, but ultimately they're not intended to be accurate, but rather they are a poetic and a heroic account of events. Also, the original Vinland Sagas were written hundreds of years after the events they describe, having been transmitted orally before them. However, there was most certainly Viking exploration and settlement in America, evidenced by one surviving archaeological site in Newfoundland, Lons Meadows. Some other historical sources include the accounts of the literate clergy of Britain who were often the victims of Viking raids. They saw Vikings as a punishment from God, and as you can imagine were quite predisposed to dislike the Vikings. Another very important source is the archaeology of Viking sites, which gives incredible insight onto the material life, extent of exploration, and sometimes even the battles that Vikings fought. Even here, however, the picture is not entirely clear. Iron cuffs and chains could be evidence of slavery, but they also could have been used for prisoners or even animals. Let's continue on to something shown in the anime. Was slavery the subject of one of the first on-screen conflicts, an aspect of Viking life? Absolutely. In fact, the three classes of Viking society, thralls, carls, and jarls, of which thralls were slaves, was considered to have been established by the gods. Slaves were up to a quarter of the population and were captured on raids. One use for slaves would have been the maintenance of the famous Viking ships, which would have required significant labor to produce. On the topic of religion, are these the same Norse people who created and believed in Norse mythology? Yes. For example, the Vikings, a disciplined group of Vikings featured in the anime, were fervent in their worship of traditional Norse deities. However, the fact that Viking raids often targeted Christian churches should not be taken to indicate that they were fighting for religious reasons. Rather, this was mostly because churches were seen as having valuable goods to pillage. Also, by the year 1000, when the anime takes place, the Christianization of Scandinavia was already well underway, and by 1200 in Denmark, it was more or less complete, with many Christian institutions already established. Finally, on the arms and the armor of the Vikings, a spear and a round wooden shield would have been a very common set of armaments for a Viking, with swords perhaps less often used than the anime might suggest. Helmets, never with horns, would have only been for wealthy Vikings, and most were protected only with their shield. That's the information I find most relevant to the show. Once again, this is only a cursory exploration of Norse history and culture, and I encourage you to do further reading of your own. I had a lot of fun making this video as before I began the research process, I myself possessed many of the gaps in knowledge that I tried to correct in this video. I hope I made these concepts more comprehensible for you in the future, and that it will enhance your enjoyment of Vinland Saga. Thank you.